Hello, and today on GBN Health, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Carl Hennigan. He is the Director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University and also an urgent care GP. Welcome, Carl.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for having me.
And we're really excited today because, Carl, you've been working on a series of articles which are based on your research on the Medicines, Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the body that is meant to oversee the safety of vaccines and of drugs and of devices for the population. And what you've exposed is that it's not working properly. It's not keeping us safe. And there are tens of thousands of people who are either dead, disabled, or harmed by drugs and devices in this country where warnings were not picked up. This is a huge body of work that you've produced, and we're going to have to deal with it in pieces. And I'd like to start first with one small topic, which was a big topic, but it's an area of your research, which is the COVID vaccines, which is what you've been looking at recently. And we can move on to the other stuff and why the regulator isn't working. But let's start with that. So you've produced some material recently looking at the different vaccines and how they were approved and the problems. So first of all, let's talk about the approval process for those vaccines and the problems with that. And they're all different, as we know. But shall we start with the AstraZeneca, which we know?
Yeah, I guess we became interested in about 2022 when there were signals in the data of excess mortality in the UK, which was quite significant mortality increases. And at that time, there's been lots of interest because the AstraZeneca had become available and then was disappearing because it had lots of problems, particularly in young people with blood clots and a particular type of blood clot that led to disabling and in some people death. And then latterly the Pfizer, because that replaced the vaccine. And together with my colleague Tom Jefferson, we've wrote about 60 or 70 articles basically trying to understand the process of how the vaccines were approved and what were the shortcomings. And what we saw in the pandemic was an expedited process that these vaccines were rushed through. And many of the important issues in the regulatory processes were missed out, particularly looking at the safety of the drug, something we call pharmacokinetics. To most people, this is really boring, but to us in Trust the Evidence, it's sort of stuff we're really interested in. What did you do to say, look, it's safe? What about its potential to cause cancer? What about in pregnant women? What about the trials? Did they actually look at the issues in detail? And the important issue is the decision to take a vaccine is about the benefits versus the harms. And if the benefits weigh the harms, you can make an informed decision. And that's crucial to an evidence-based approach. So the first bit we really got wrong, which I wrote about first, was the idea that we were going to mandate vaccines. And if you look into under the bonnet of the regulatory process, the manufacturer said, well, we didn't study transmission. And in fact, the place to look is in the package insert. There's nothing about transmission. So the only reason to mandate a vaccine is not because it benefits you, is because it's going to help prevent you passing it on to somebody else. And once
forgive me, there was a lot of articles and a lot of claims about the fact that it reduced, well, first of all, that it stopped transmission. That's what we were told. It stopped transmission. And then there were lots of claims that it reduced transmission. Are you saying that that was never tested?
No, it was never tested in the regulatory processes. It's never been claimed by the manufacturers. And it's not in the most important document, which is called the package insert, which under the regulatory laws, all of the information of the benefits and the harms has to go in. Now, importantly, what happened early on is lots of poor quality evidence, letters, correspondence went to these famous journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, who published them immediately and said, we've got evidence that it reduces transmission. But this was very low quality retrospective data. It wasn't the clinical trials. It wasn't the regulatory data. And subsequently, when people did better quality studies, that actually they came out and said actually doesn't prevent transmission. And I think that's well established now, apart from if you go to the COVID inquiry, you can't quite understand this issue at hand, is these vaccines do not prevent the onward transmission of the virus. If they did, we'd have seen a very different picture going into 21, 22. Remember, if you go back to the winter of 21, we were still talking about lockdowns, despite all the huge number of people who'd been vaccinated.
Yes, and many people were sort of effectively locked down unless they had, or some even lost their jobs unless they had a vaccine. So you're saying that was based on misinformation. But
I'm sorry, Lucy, I'll just come in. It was particularly people who worked in care homes where the mandate came in. And actually what happened in care homes is they lost about 40,000 staff, because what was happening is young people particularly were looking and listening to some of the signals in the data and were cautious, and they were right to be cautious. What was not right was the government to then say you would lose your job if you didn't have the vaccine. Now, what happened is it was due to becoming enforced in, I think, about April 22 in the whole health service. And about a month before, it was Sajid Javid, I think, was the health minister at the time, saw the writing on the wall and said, no, we're repealing this because actually we're going to lose a huge swathe of staff in the health services as well, or you're going to have to redeploy them from the front line. What they were doing were basically asking questions and wanted to be informed. And the important issue about any intervention is ultimately it's about informed consent, and the decision is up to you, not me as a health practitioner. My job is to inform you about what to do next.
So one could argue that the vaccines were important to reduce the burden on the hospitals and to save lives. Are you sort of arguing, from your research, have you found that the vaccines actually also cause problems? And should those problems have been picked up earlier? What kind of problems did you find? I mean, we know that there's a heart inflammation. Are you saying that was picked up too late, I think you've written?
Well, this is an important concept. The AstraZeneca vaccine, what was happening in countries like Norway, Sweden and Denmark, they were pulling it off the market. And yet here we were still having it across all age ranges. And I think by March the 31st, I think there was something like 79 blood clots and 15 people had died. And more than half of those were in under 50s. And so there were significant signals in younger people that not only was it causing significant harms, it was actually leading to death in some people. Now, what happened is across the board in Europe, they started to pull the drug. Here we differed for quite some time until we raised the age limit to 30, then to 40. What I'm seeing is if you fail to act on signals, what happens is ultimately that drug or that vaccine will fail. Because what you need to do is, in where the harms outweigh the benefits, you need to get it off the market efficiently. The problem is our system, and this has come up in government, for detecting harms that was first developed in 1964, is completely out of date and completely unfit for purpose, the yellow card system. And why is that? It only picks up about 2% of the adverse events, the serious adverse events, when we get new drugs or devices that come into practice.
Where's that based on? That 2% is based on what? Because it would argue, the regulator says that it's impartial, it looks at evidence. It also says that with the vaccine, it put it in a black triangle and was looking for problems all the time. That's what it argues.
So that 2% is based on systematic review evidence of all the published trials. We can go back to 2005 when there was a Commons Health Select Committee that looked into the MHRA and said there are serious failings in the yellow card system. I could go to the Independent Medicines and Medical Device Safety Review led by Baroness Cumberledge, who said the yellow card system needs reforming because there are serious issues with it.
And the yellow card system is the system in which people and doctors can write in and report side effects.
Well, look, this is important. When it was devised in 1964, it was for health professionals. Then it went to pharmacists. In 2005, it was then opened up for the public to be able to submit their own responses. I bet if I asked your people on this show how many people are aware they can submit a response, I bet actually most people would go, I didn't know that. Surveys suggest at best, it's about 1 in 12, 1 in 15 know about the yellow card system and know you can respond. But actually, I suspect it's got worse because that was during a bit of a publicity about the system. So you are able to submit a yellow card. Number one is actually the huge population are not aware of it. And then a huge number don't think it's even worth it. Whereas in other countries like Norway, I'm a doctor. It's a legal requirement. If you come in to see me with an adverse event, legally, I have to submit a response to the regulator. Here, it's just something I can do if I think it's a good idea or not. So there are huge shortcomings. And I'll give you just one example from a North of England trust. There were about 1,000 incidents that were related to a particular drug called a direct oral anticoagulant.
So blood thinner.
Blood thinner that leads to GI bleeds, gastrointestinal bleeds. These people were admitted to hospital with a GI bleed, and actually they were then assigned the cause was the drug. Of the 1,000, they looked at how many yellow cards had been reported for those individuals. 6 out of 1,000. So that tells you what the yellow card system is like and how useful it is. We could develop real-time dashboards. We could use the data within general practice systems and produce transparent updates in real time and avert huge problems in the system. But instead, we like to have this secret system that is not fit for purpose.
Let's talk a little bit more about the vaccines, because you've looked at that in such detail at Trust the Evidence, which is where you've published your work. So we know about the AstraZeneca jab. It has been withdrawn. You've also looked at the Pfizer jab, which uses a sort of coding to recode the body to disable a virus. So normally the normal vaccines use a weakened or inactivated part of the pathogen to try and get the body to recognise it. But this is different. Have you got concerns about that vaccine? First, you've already talked about transmission. It doesn't stop that. Do you have concerns about the harms of that vaccine?
So there are a couple of things. You're right. A normal vaccine is you take a bit of an antigen, inject it into your body, and you create an immune response. And that can be from a virus that has been inactivated or some bit of the virus. And that's more like what the AstraZeneca was. This is a compound which is called a messenger RNA that goes into your cells, interacts with your cells, and then produces the spike protein. But it's not just messenger.
It's dealing with the genetics. It's recoding.
Yeah, and producing proteins that you will then create the immune cells to. But first off, it's encapsulated in a sort of packaging, if you like, and that's called a lipid nanoparticles. Just think of it, very tiny lipids, a bit like the Amazon package that when you open it up, this is the coating. And then LNPs are a new technology for even the regulator says we don't know much about this. And there are lots of things we don't know. How the half-life, we're not sure. The biodistribution, where does it go? Well, in rats, it goes in ovaries, the spleen, the liver, and a bit everywhere else, but they're the major organs. When it gets there, how does it interact with the cellular surface? And people have lots of concerns about this. The more times you have it, does it build up and become toxic? Because we're not clear how well it's distributed and then how much it's cleared and how long that takes. Then you've got the messenger RNA that can go, because it's designed to take the messenger RNA round the body to evade the immune system. And so this modified messenger RNA can go in all sorts of different organs. So one of the concerns is if it gets in the heart, start producing these proteins, your immune system attacks your heart cells, then you get this myocarditis. And that's well established. It's factual because it's in the packaging inserts, and it's more likely to occur in younger males. And so
that's heart inflammation, and it can be deadly, can't it?
Yeah. And then we've just put out today the other concerns we have, the other two concerns I have, I've got the numbers here, is the people you really want this vaccine for are the over 65s. Yeah, because they're the people who do worse from COVID. Well, the Kansas City Attorney General has put a legal report together questioning Pfizer, asking why in the age group 65 to 84 was there only 12 people in the trials. Why are there nobody over 85 in the trials? And why are those who would benefit most, the immunocompromised, excluded? We also know today that in pregnant women, one of the things he said is we're going to do a large study of over 4,000 women, a randomized control trial, which is what you want to do. You give half the people the vaccine and half the people are controls, a placebo. That really helps you understand. There was a big fanfare when that study was launched. This is what we're going to use to keep you safe. It promised to have over 4,000 women in the trial. Yet,
Pregnant women.
Published pregnant women in the trial. Yet, 2 years later, after the fanfare has disappeared, less than 400 women were included in this trial. Not only that, those in the first trimester were excluded.
So the first 12 weeks, when you're more likely to have problems with influence the baby's development in those first 12 weeks, those women were excluded. Exactly,
because in them first 12 weeks, that's when you're developing all the organs. Your heart's developing, your brain, your legs, your arms, and after 12 weeks, what you're doing is putting on weight. You can still.
And forgive me to just point out, but the NHS, I looked at it today, it's still promoting and telling women of all stages of pregnancy that they are strongly recommended to get the COVID vaccine, despite the fact that it hasn't been widely tested in pregnant women. Is that
the issue here is? The issue here is for pregnancy is a condition where you down-regulate your immune system. So if you get an acute respiratory infection like influenza, coronavirus, all of them really, you can get quite unwell because your immune system's been dampened down. And it does that to protect the fetus. You don't want your immune system attacking the fetus. They can do quite badly. So you really want to understand what treatments work. Now, when it comes to drugs, we're incredibly cautious with women. We use all sorts of very old drugs for hypertension because we're really cautious about using anything new unless it's been studied in pharmacokinetics in detail and we've done the clinical trials. Yet here, I don't understand why people think they can provide information without accepting in the package inserts, in the regulatory. They said, we haven't done the trials at the regulatory stage. We were going to do this trial. So our position is what we need to do is take this back into the research. If you want to use it, do the proper trial, do the 4,000 person trial, follow these women up for long enough, follow their children up for long enough, and please address the issue at hand. And then, as Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine, I can give you an evidence-informed answer.
Are there any other signals that you have? We say that we don't know what happens to those little fatty lipid nanoparticles, the particles that go around the body and deliver this code of mRNA. But do we know there are any other signals, safety signals, apart from the heart inflammation, which we have seen and is now recognised and acknowledged? Or are we? Do you think we're sitting on a time bomb?
Yeah, there's lots of complications here, and the problem here is the thing is,
such as what?
Bell's palsy.
Bell's palsy. So that is when the face drops. It's
neurological complication. Now, what happens is you think, well, it's 1 in 1,000. That's not many. But actually what happens is as you step up the number of people who get the vaccine, so if you go 10,000, that's 10, 100,000, that's 100. By the time you get 1 million people, you're at 1,000 cases, aren't you? Well, give it 10 million people, you're at 10,000 cases. So that's the problem when you have very big population interventions, which don't normally happen. You must ensure that actually they're safe because the numbers of harms ramp up really quickly.
So you're saying that the signal may not be picked up in a smaller trial with people that are handpicked and not in certain age groups or with certain illnesses or certain conditions. The signal may not be picked up in the early trials. And surely the regulator, the Medicines Healthcare Regulatory and Products Regulatory Agency, is there to do that. And if they had picked up a signal of Bell's palsy or anything else, we would know about it. Is that not the case?
Well, no. Well, look, let me take you back in time to 1954. Time before even me and you were born, Lucy. Give our age away. I wasn't. But look, I'm going to take you back. When we went to develop the polio vaccine, the Salk polio vaccine trial, they brought it out in children. They randomized something like exact numbers, about 630,000 children to the vaccine and 1 million to the control. So they had a trial that was over 1.6 million people. This is in 1950. And they did it that way because they wanted to reassure the public it was safe and it was effective. And we have the largest trial to understand what's going on. Now people think, well, we did it in 40,000 people. That's long enough. And we followed them up for 28 days. No, it's unacceptable. We need to go back in history and understand. We need to do trials of this size to be able to understand the true effects and then reassure people. In terms of other issues, there are lots of issues. There's been this issue about, well, in the trial, it was developed with a different batch, a different methods, and then the methods used for giving it out to the public is a completely different method that has DNA contamination in it and lots of problems and lipid dispersion, all sorts of things I could talk about that actually make you think that actually what the public are getting is not what was trialed. So that's
what would you do if you could with that COVID vaccine now? I mean, you would never have mandated it. Would you just say this is something for the over 65s to choose? Will we ever know whether it saved lives, and will we ever know the harm it's caused? Because we don't have a group that hasn't really taken it or that we're studying.
Yeah, I think it will be very difficult in the absence of robust randomized trials. It's always very difficult to tell either way. And what's happening here is you've got both sides of the argument. People saying, look, it saved millions of lives. And over here, people saying it killed millions of lives. When you get such polarization, it's always a failure in the evidence base because there's so huge uncertainty and then you can get lots of opinions. One of the key things, for instance, to use is low quality observational study. When you say it saves millions of lives, observational studies are always affected by what we call the healthy vaccine bias, that the people who turn up for the vaccine tend to be more healthy than those that don't. In addition, people who are at the end of life or who are dying in the next few months will not take up preventive actions and will go, look, I'm sorry, I don't want a vaccine. I don't want any interventions. In fact, we tend to take away their interventions in the end of life scenario. So when you come and look at the observational data, it's completely skewed. And it can be skewed sometimes both ways, but actually doesn't help us understand the effect of mortality compared to a randomized controlled trial. So what we need to do is every time you come out in winter, you start to think, look, resources are finite. The most important thing is we need to keep people safe. What I'm saying is there's not like £1 trillion there for healthcare. What we've got is a cake that at the moment is about 190 billion with what Labour's put in extra. And you need to spend that wisely. To spend your healthcare wisely, you need to start with the basic principle of first do no harm. Now, if it was me, every time I was coming to winter, I would be saying, look, when we're bringing out these new vaccines, at the moment, we seem to have an approach which is develop low quality evidence, put them out there. I'd be saying, look, let's do some more randomized controlled trials here. And let's give it with the outcomes that matter. Hospitalization, death, secondary complications, not just a little antibody rise, which these vaccines do achieve all the time. What we want to know is, does it last through the winter? Is it actually making a difference? So like as we went into this winter, when we had severe pressures in A&E, actually, we did have a rollout of vaccines, but actually we still can't cope with the winter pressures. And so we need to go back to basics and go back to doing the randomized controlled trials and developing a high quality evidence base.
One could argue, and I don't want to sort of go in too much on this, but one could argue that we were in an emergency situation. The hospitals were in danger of being overwhelmed. It was better than nothing, and we needed to do something.
No, by the time they arrived, we'd already were into 2021. I think the jury is starting to look in back in time and realize many of the interventions, in fact, of the 200 different policy interventions that we tried in 2020, not one of them actually made any difference to what happened next. And in addition, you can argue made things worse. And that's another interesting. But all this rule of 6, 10 o'clock curfew, all of that actually didn't work. What did happen is a huge swathe of people got the infection. Go and look at the numbers. Everybody, I don't know anybody who didn't get it, who basically developed natural immunity, which is the way we always exit a new pathogen arriving. As more and more people get it, more and more people develop some natural immunity, and that puts a brake on the level of infection. In effect, one of the things that is really contentious is whether you should be vaccinating people right in the middle of winter when the risk of catching the infection is the greatest. Because one of the things we discovered is that what the vaccine does do is give, in a certain number of people, it drops their white blood cells called lymphocytes. And they're the sort of generals, if you like, that arrive to help you when you get a viral infection. And you want lots of them, not for them to come down. So really, if you wanted to understand if it doesn't affect transmission, then the real question at hand is how can it affect the course of the illness? What we really would want to do is to do trials in the population that matter, over 65s, but they tend to be not represented and have very low numbers in the randomized controlled trials. And I think that is, one, a mistake, but two, you have to ask questions. I don't understand why that's the case. Why did Pfizer only have 12 people over the age of 65? I know the AstraZeneca only had a very few people. Is it they're concerned about they won't mount a robust response? What are the issues at hand? But generally, look, people over 65, if they get an acute respiratory infection, they can do really badly. I accept that. And not only from all sorts of cardiovascular disease problems, renal problems, bacterial complications like pneumonia. It really is a problem in winter. We really do need to include these people in the trials and understand to develop an evidence base around what works and what doesn't, and stop spending money on things that don't work.
Would you say that you would want this vaccine to be withdrawn until we have better evidence on it for all people?
Look, I don't think that's not my job. You're forcing me into being a policy initiative person. Look, I think if you bring these things into an evidence base, then you can understand what works and what doesn't. Withdrawing something means you can never work out. So the AstraZeneca, we have no idea what works and what doesn't, do we now? And we'll never know. And that's the end of it. I do think there's something, though, clear to me. In those of childbearing age or who are pregnant, it should be used in the context of a randomized controlled trial. And that trial should be adequately powered to detect the important congenital
What about
malformations.
children?
Well, I think the jury is quite clear. The children don't benefit from the vaccine, and there are no benefits, and therefore doesn't need to be withdrawn. Yeah. It's not an indication. Remember, look, children do badly from certain acute respiratory infections like RSV, even influenza under 5. But actually from coronaviruses, because there are 4 other circulating ones, they seem to have lots of cross-reactive immunity. And to them, it's a mild illness that actually the harms of the vaccine will outweigh the benefits. So it's not that you withdraw it. It's just not an indication in children to give it.
There have been claims circulating on social media, and I'm glad you're here to kind of look at them with us, but that some people have been saying that this is something that turbo boosts certain cancers. Is there any evidence for that?
Well, look, I think there's mechanistic evidence about the interaction at the cellular level, these lipid nanoparticles, how they interact, and then may stimulate some parts of the immune system. But what I think we do need is to have a grown-up debate here and start to be able to question it. It's right, we should be able to question what's happening and then try and understand and determine what's going in an evidence-based way. Many of what I said early on, the pharmacokinetic studies, have not been done to address these issues. So I think it's right for people to ask these questions and raise them. And to be honest with you, this is my job. This is the regulator's job to go, we have concerns out there. This is how we're going to address it. What they shouldn't do is dismiss people at this stage and say, no, we have all the evidence to date that it's safe and effective. Well, what we are seeing latterly from the MHRA and our regulators is an approach which says we want to actually keep some of this information away from you in secret. So they publish minutes and then withdraw them and then republish them with redactions. And what they do is try to remove important information about how the batches, how they were different between batch 1 and 2, which can have huge important issues. For instance, introduction of this DNA into the cellular level as well, which could be a real problem. So look, we need to start getting grown up. If we want to have a health service that's fit for purpose, we need to be more transparent. And particularly, we need to accept that harms are out there and stop being defensive, trying to cover our backside, and be honest that actually sometimes the regulators make mistakes And in doing so, the most important is to respond to that signal, say there's a problem, and then try and put it right with an evidence-based approach.
I'm Lucy Johnston. I've been chatting to Professor Carl Hennigan, Director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. This is GBN Health. Stay tuned for the next part where we do a deep dive into why the health regulator is failing to keep us safe.